There's one strange thing that generally otherwise seemingly normal people, mostly in the Western world, seem to do. And that is when they decide they want a pet, a cat or a dog to love and to play with, do they go and find a lovingly raised, beautifully homed animal? No. They go to the RSPCA or some other cat or dog rescue centre, and they find one that has a traumatic past and has ended up needing to be looked after in a shelter. Now, without trying to understand why we do that, part of the process is that before we take the animal home, we are sat down by the professional and we have explained to us the abnormal behaviour that the animal exhibits, anything from biting and clawing to peeing and pooing in strange areas, to howling and scratching and anyway, any number of strange things. We then have explained to us why the animal has developed this kind of behaviour. And it's because of some awful traumatic past from past owners or other kinds of trauma. Knowing all this about the dog or the cat we are going to take home, we still decide that this is the one for us. And we fall in love at first sight and take our kitty or our puppy or our older animal home. Now, we bear the animal no resentment whatsoever when it poos in strange places and scratches furniture beyond use, or, smashes windows, or whatever activity behaviouralists would say was strange. And yet, the odd thing is that we bear the animal absolutely no resentment. We have purely, totally forgiven this darling creature for its behaviour, current behaviour, because we know it stems from its traumatic past. And over the days and weeks and months and maybe years, we learn how to love and make feel secure and safe this poor creature, so that we develop an intimate and wonderful loving relationship with this animal, and he no longer or she no longer exhibits this same behaviour. It's now, as we would call it, house trained. Why on earth we do that? Now, all over the planet, people are doing the same thing, but not with animals, but with people. Family members, siblings, parents, lovers, partners, meaningful friends, significant others, and we have fallen in love with them at first sight. And we enjoy their character, we enjoy their company, and but the more we get to know them, the more we realise that they have some terrible traits. Not just quirky, but actually quite hurtful. They can snap at us, or they can undermine us, or they can do all manner of other things that actually make us feel rather like shit. But rather than saying, wonder if this person has a traumatic past that has caused its current unpleasant behaviour, and that I need to forgive it, find out what the past is and forgive it. No, It splits families wide open. It causes divorces and people who were deeply in love to suddenly be alienated, and for friends who have cared deeply for each other for years to suddenly no longer speak to each other. So, why is it that, especially when we're looking for a partner, we hope we're finding a perfectly undamaged person, when in actual fact, when you go to a club or a pub or go on to Match.com or some other dating site, what you're really going to is the RSPCAP, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to the Average Person. And what I mean by that is, we don't first of all meet the family and find out if this person has had a loving and, non-traumatic upbringing and therefore is going to be suitable to be a companion to us. No, we just dive in, fall madly in love. We also have no choice over the families that we are born into. And parents, having their own traumatic pasts, quite often behave in odd and hurtful, very hurtful sometimes, behaviours. Or a very good friend who has been a mainstay for years suddenly falls out with us and we don't understand why. Quirky behaviour has begun that hurts us, and so we are alienated from them. Now, when I talk about forgiveness, I'm not talking about child sex abusers or rapists or murderers or terrorists or anybody else who exhibits evil behaviour. Not talking about building relationships back with people like that. This is generally about your average family, your average relationships. A friend and I, you see, were recently having a conversation in which the man that she has been dating for several years, suddenly something occurred in which she realised that he has patterns of behaviour and traits, if you want to call it, that are impeding upon their relationship. Now, they've discussed it, generally, why do you do that? And da-da-da-da, and can't you stop that? And don't you realise that upsets me? And my God, can't you see there's no common sense in the way you're behaving? But what has happened then begins for the deep love and acceptance that this person began to feel for the other slightly begins to and generally begins to erode. Now, the same happens with parents, especially once we become teenagers and in our 20s. We suddenly realise that the behaviour that they sometimes or often have shown toward us is not normal. We begin to compare it with the way our friends' families, behave and act. And we see that, my mother really is quite cruel at times. Or my father really is quite neglectful and a spendthrift, and we never have enough money and things like that. And the same with a friend. Something totally non-understandable happens and we're alienated. What we don't tend to do with people that we do with animals is ask, what about your past is it that causes you to behave this way in the present? And is there any way that we can look at it and perhaps fix it, or at least sort it out a bit, or help me to accommodate it and understand you better? No, we just stomp off, tell everyone what a nasty piece of that person was, and don't go home for Christmas, and don't talk to our friends anymore, and leave our lovers or husbands. Now, this friend of mine that I was chatting to about this, I brought this up, and I said to her, have you considered that some of the behaviour he is showing now, because of some choices, bad choices that he made before you knew him, were actually choices that he made that were survival tactics through traumatic or difficult times and relationships in his own life, and that he has developed, or she has developed, behavioural attitudes or traits that, you know, are slowly eroding your respect and your deep romantic love for this person. And you're not quite sure what to do. You're not quite sure whether this is the person for you and whether you're going to move on. The same with family members and friends. Have we ever sat down and said to our fathers or mothers, what was your upbringing like? How did your mum and dad treat you? Were you ever abused? Did any significant other in your life ever put you through trauma? What survival instincts and coping mechanisms did you form back then that now still show themselves in the unpleasant and hurtful behaviour that you sometimes show? No, we don't do that. We do it with cats and dogs, but we don't do it with people. So I suggested to my friend, because I know her partner's past, I suggested to her that some of the things that he had gone through would have caused him to have developed some of the choices he made. Bad choices, but survival choices at the time, because of the difficult woman he was with at the time, and because of difficult job situations, financial situations, and a pattern began that enabled him to survive those at the time, but that now he didn't need, but they had become embedded. And could we discuss them and see if we can talk them through, and maybe, if they're willing, even look at therapy to see how we can mend the past and have a better present and a more positive future. The same with best friends, the same with parents. And she went, oh my God, I never thought of that. And I explained to her that for the last 5 years of my father's life, I nursed him. He had vascular dementia. And when I say nurse him, I mean there wasn't one part of his body I didn't see and wash quite often. Well, every day, actually. So it was a very intimate relationship that developed. And the more I looked after him, the more I realised how much I resented him and how much anger had built up inside me over my childhood and my teenage years and my adult years toward him. Now, he was raised in a very traumatic atmosphere, and a lot of insecurity, a lot of attachment problems, a lot of abuse, a lot of rejection. And it wasn't actually until he met my mother that he had ever spent any time with a family. He'd been raised in a very Spartan orphanage, separated from his brothers and sisters from the age of 4. Now, as a result, some of his behaviour towards us as a youngster seemed the most odd and weird and hurtful at times and beguiling and just very strange. And as a result of some of that, I developed complex PTSD. Now, that complex PTSD went on to thwart so much of my adult life, in relationships, in not being able to stick to a career because I kept having these psychological episodes related to my father's behaviour. Now, what to do? Here's a man in his 80s. So let's say he's an elderly rescue cat or dog that I've got from the pound. Do I carry on with the anger and resentment toward him because of the behavioural patterns he had developed so that he would survive as a youngster through the trauma and difficulties he experienced? No. I developed anger and resentment toward him. And I hadn't realised how much anger and resentment I had toward him for the way my life had turned out as a result of so much of his behaviour, until I was here 5 years living in his home, looking after him 24/7. I realised I didn't want my father to die without making peace. Now, I couldn't make peace with my father as in discussing it with him because he had dementia, so I had to figure out a way of making peace and forgiving him within myself. So I began to look at the life that he had lived, and I began to look at some of the behavioural patterns he had showed while raising me. And suddenly it made perfect sense that of course he would have these, let's call them deficits and negative behavioural patterns in order to have survived what he went through, because he knew no better. And as an adult, he didn't have the insight to realise now things must change, so he was doing the best he could with who he was at the time. So it seems a bit bad to be comparing my father to a rescue puppy, but what I'm saying is I chose to forgive my father for how he had behaved at times towards me and the distress and the disturbance that it had caused me, because I realised actually it wasn't his fault. It wasn't abuse, in what we would call abuse. It was just certain behaviours. And over the 5 years, I worked very hard because let me tell you, forgiveness is not sentimental. Forgiveness is not sexy. Forgiveness is not easy. You've got to take your shoes off and you've got to walk that gravel-covered track for as long as it takes to understand and be in their shoes and to let go of what you've held on to that has come between the two of you. Now, sadly, my father and I weren't able to reconcile in the way that friends can, or siblings or partners or parents that are well can. But by the time he died, peacefully at home with me and my sister, I was saying goodbye to a man, to my father, who I truly loved. So if you have in your life, because we all do, relationship issues, and as I said, I'm not talking about deeply abusive ones that we need to step away from. I'm talking about ones that have gone awry out of some misunderstanding. Maybe you could meet up with, or at least reach out to, that person and begin to try and understand that what their behaviour now is a result of in the past, and begin the journey of forgiveness so that lovers come together again, families have happy, joyful Christmases again, and friends are reunited. Just a thought. Take care.